raised in non-wild environments. And because of that, I think a good rule of thumb might be eat animals that are eating what nature intended them to eat. So in terms of meat and poultry, it's grass or forage. And there is some science in the nutritional benefits, as Michael said. I think it's not hugely conclusive, and there could probably be more, but in general they look better in terms of their fat profiles and healthier fats than meat from animals that are raised on corn or soybeans. But the same thing goes for fish. And this is going to be a real issue, I think, as we deplete our fish stocks, our wild fish stocks. In general, wild fish are better. They have fewer contaminants. They have diets that are lower in grains. And yet, we're hitting this issue where a lot of the fish we're eating is farmed. And so I think that's going to be a tough issue as things go forward.
So we're now going to sort of move into the next part. We're really going to get into a lot of the macro issues in a little bit more detail. I invite two of our colleagues to come up and join us. First is Dan Imhoff, a writer and researcher on issues related to food, the environment, and design. He's the author of numerous articles and essays and books, including Paper or Plastic, Searching for Solutions to an Overpackaged World, Farming with the Wild, and his recent book, Food Fight, A Citizen's Guide to Food and the Farm Bill. And also Scotty Johnson, who's a teacher, writer, counselor, and senior outreach representative for the Defenders of Wildlife. Johnson has an extensive experience with food policy and the Farm Bill dating back 10 years. His early duties with the Defenders included leading a national investigation to the American Farm Bill Federation that exposed much of what he says is the dark underbelly of corporate agribusiness and resulted in a CBS 60 Minutes expose. We're going to kick this session off by having David talk a little bit about sort of what are the biggest issues here, and then have Dan and Scotty join us for a few minutes of conversation from their perspective, and then move into some more dialogue.
Well, sorry. We talked a little bit about personal decisions around food, and as we think about ways to leverage better food environments and better food systems, I think the personal choices and what we do in our own home is really important. But there are other points of leverage. The Farm Bill is one of them, but I want to touch on two others. We all have jobs, and our children have jobs too, and those are called schools. And we have our workplaces, and for many of us, especially for the kids, this is where they get a lot of their meals. And so I think our decisions about the kind of food that are being offered in our workplaces are really important. And as people that work there, or as taxpayers that support schools or pay tuition, we ought to have a say in that. One particular workplace that I've been working in is hospitals, and Andy mentioned this, that it's really, it's kind of pathetic that healthy food in hospitals is a bit of an oxymoron, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be that way. What the good news, though, is that through a number of partners, I'm involved with a project called Healthcare Without Harm. This is about 400 health groups and hospitals and other institutions worldwide. And for the last 2 years, they've been actively working to get hospitals to take a leadership role in buying healthier food. And the way they think about health is not just nutritionally healthy, but also food that is green and affordable and socially just. So that means raised in ways that are going to benefit farm workers, and food that is raised in ways that are also supportive of communities and give people in low-income communities access. So I want to just share with you a couple of the things that we're doing as part of that project. One thing we've done is to just create a pledge, and I've got a few copies of these. It's called the Healthy Food and Healthcare Pledge, a pledge for fresh, local, and sustainable food. And we've now got 54 hospitals across the U.S. that have signed this, which is essentially a goal statement saying we think food's important and we're going to work on it. And this includes all the 42 hospitals in Catholic Health West system. It includes hospitals in Boston, in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Portland, in Seattle, in this Bay Area. I mean, it's short across the country. So I think that's really exciting. Individually, there are food managers in some hospitals who are doing incredible stuff. And the theme here in our work has been baby steps. Many of them are a little overwhelmed in the beginning, but they find that if they just start small and start doing what they can do, that it's really empowering, and people love it. And so now, with this approach, in the Kaiser Permanente system, there's farmers markets outside more than 40 hospitals. Fletcher Allen is the academic health center for Vermont in Burlington. They've been composting food waste for 15 years. They're offering organic food on their patient menus. They're buying dairy products that are local, obviously from Vermont dairy farmers, but are also free of RBGH hormone. Another example is Swedish Covenant Hospital in Chicago. They're a 300-bed hospital. They've signed the Healthy Food Pledge, and they're also starting to change their patient food service in some interesting ways. And these are just a couple of examples. And I want to just mention that now we've had 2 national meetings called FoodMed, and these are day-long meetings for food managers in hospital settings and hospital executives. The first one in California drew about 400 or 500 people. The next one is at the end of June in Boston, and if you're interested, it's foodmed.org. And this is where we're building this work, and it's really very exciting. And so then finally, I think there's a point of leverage that we've all talked about in the Farm Bill, and this is, and I'm going to let Scott and Dan talk about this, but I want to just emphasize that it's incredible the power of a phone call to an elected official, or 2 phone calls, or 4 phone calls. You can really change their decisions with your short phone call.
Can I make one quick comment? I'm overjoyed to hear this kind of work, but just to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're up against, over 40% of hospitals in this country now have fast food restaurants on their premises, and that number is going up. The big food service contractors like Marriott have a lockhold on institutional food in many hospitals, in prisons, in senior communities. Their eye is on bottom line profit, and they will not budge at the moment. So there are tremendous obstacles, but this is a beginning.
So Dan, are you going to start and give us some background a little bit on the Farm Bill, or the Food Bill, as Michael says?
With the fat bill. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here, rather humbling. I was asked a few weeks ago, what was the aha moment? Why would you possibly write a book about the Farm Bill? And I was at a conference in Sacramento in 2005, and it was all about the Farm Bill. And I'd written about the Farm Bill before, but I had no idea. I was rather dazzled by the ramifications that this single legislation sets in motion. And it was on the heels of an energy bill and a transportation bill that seemed to really not address a lot of the crucial issues that we're facing, and rather was giving tax breaks to oil companies and breaks for people who drove SUVs and things like that. And I thought, gosh, here's a bill. It determines what our kids eat for lunch, or for their school lunch. It determines the state of our waterways and aquatic systems in our farm country, and also thousands of miles away. It determines whether or not we're good international trading partners and we live up to our international trade agreements. It determines the fate of wild species on millions of acres of private land. Our ability to provide feed and food and fiber and habitats and increasingly fuel for ourselves. It determines the dumping or the illegal trading of subsidized crops in other countries, which sets whole communities in motion. And it also determines the fate of family farmers both here and abroad. And it is this incredible pressure point. And I think the important thing that I want us all to realize is that it's our money. It's our taxpayer dollars. And for decades, these discussions about the Farm Bill, they've been taking place behind closed doors, and none of us really, we've sort of given over our vote on the Farm Bill because we think it's really impenetrable. And I would argue that it's really not, and it's actually quite an interesting thing to look into, and we all have a stake in it. So what exactly is it? It's a $90 billion set of programs that are arranged in a number of titles, about 10 different titles. And it's referred to as the Farm Bill. It gets passed every 5 years, as Andy mentioned before. They call it an omnibus legislation, and that just means that it's dealing with multiple issues at the same time, because it's legislatively convenient for them to just package all their special interests into one bill. But this omnibus nature makes us oblivious because it's so complicated, it's very difficult for any one person to really get their arms around it. So it's $90 billion, but if you were just to say that it's a dollar bill, half of that money goes to food and nutrition programs, food stamps, food safety nets for about 35 million Americans who need hunger assistance. They now call that relative food insecurity. Within the USDA, they're not allowed to talk about hunger anymore. But 35 million Americans, at least half of which are children, and also our school lunch and breakfast programs fall under this category. The important thing is that during any Farm Bill, a child in the public school system is going to get a significant amount of their daily calories from what we're feeding them. And I think we'll get to that later, and we won't be happy with what they get, because basically the other third of the dollar, a third of the dollar, basically gives us high fructose corn syrup and trans fats for all. It supports a very, very narrow crop of 5 different crops: corn, cotton, wheat, rice, and soybeans. Sugar and milk are also in there, and these become the cheap ingredients of the industrial food system that we've heard about. About 1/10 of the bill goes for conservation programs. Hugely important because half of our lands are in private hands, and 70% of our land is in either forest or farming, ranching, or grazing. And so our species totally depend on good stewardship. And then the last part of the dollar, the last 1/10 that's left, goes for things like food safety, organic research, renewable energy, creating farmers markets, all the ingredients of the post-industrial farming system that we just heard about. This Farm Bill has, for about 3 decades or 4 decades now, been negotiated primarily by the big ag, big commodity groups, and also the anti-hunger caucus that makes pretty much a deal with the devil in order to desperately hold on to these food stamp and these nutrition programs, which are so important. The demand for food stamps is on the rise. It's not decreasing. And the irony in the whole situation is that because the cheapest food ingredients are the unhealthiest, the nutrition crisis is really affecting the poor the hardest. And if you're struggling to put together an emergency assistance food box, you can't afford the healthy peanut butter. You go for the peanut butter that's high in trans fats and has sugar added because you're just trying to deliver calories rather than nutrition to these people who need it. It's a really interesting time to watch our government in action. This is our Farm Bill right now. There's numerous legislations swirling around Washington. We have 2 new heads of committees because of the changeover in the election. We now have Tom Harkin, who's a real fan of sustainable farming and a real advocate of good farming on the Senate Ag Committee, and Colin Peterson on the House Committee. They're putting together their respective bills, which will be merged hopefully by the end of the summer, and the bill has to be reauthorized by September 30th. Or it reverts back, or extended, or else it reverts back to a farm bill from the 1940s. I just want to say, I want to echo this point here, that the jury is out. The jury is out that the farm bills of the 20th century have to yield. That the farm bills of the industrial monoculture and the industrial feedlot and the diabetes-inducing diet and all these things that are coming along with it have to yield to this post-industrial farming system that we talked about. And it's very important that you begin to have a vision. I think what's really clearly been lacking, perhaps, of all the things that I see is that we have no vision for our food system. We have a hodgepodge of programs that we've carried on for the last 70 years, and I think all of us, if we sanely look at the facts, realize that it has to give way to a new vision, and I think it's kind of up to us to lead our representatives down that road.
So
That's why they do it, so that, it's so difficult for us to understand. I think it's really a logical leap to say, well, why don't we just take the nutrition part, the feeding, the food assistance, the school lunches, the things that are just, feeding ourselves, why don't we just make that its own bill and have the land-based legislations be on their own? That has been tried, and when the Hunger Lobby and the Hunger Caucus, which is really powerful in Washington, has tried to go around that, they're so afraid of losing, they get threatened. If you don't vote with our farm bill, then we're not going to vote for your hunger assistance program. So what is new is that there are so many opportunities to build new bridges, to form another wedge. And I think the urban constituencies who care about a sustainable food system, they care about healthy foods for their kids, they realize that their health is totally related to the way we take care of our land. That's in our best interest. But I don't see anything happening until we really start to speak up and say, this is our food and farm bill.
I can't recommend too highly Dan's book, Food Fight. It's a very readable, very informative history of Farm Bill legislation, as well as an explanation of the impact this has on all of our lives and our country and our land and the world. And one of the things that really caught my eye in reading it was his comment. First of all, imagine the vested interests that weigh in on this issue. I mean, there are these huge powers of industrial agriculture there to get what they want. But he made a statement in that really caught my eye, which is that for the first time this year, there is a chance for changing the balance of some of this power if the health care and public health community can be engaged, which it never has been. It's never seen the relevance of Farm Bill legislation to health of the population. And the costs to our country in terms of healthcare dollars going down the drain for the treatment of these preventable diseases that are the direct results of food choices that people are forced to make because of Farm Bill policy, there is now the beginning of a new coalition willing to lobby on this issue. And this is one reason why we called this public forum and why we're trying to engage health professionals and make them aware. Just as I said, I was completely unaware of any of these issues until I began to hear about it, first from Michael and then by reading Dan's book.
Scotty, will you give us some of your thoughts on it?
Sure, thank you.
Is it turn?
Switch mics, okay. Hi, everybody. And thanks to Dr. Weil and Michael for the great work bringing this together. My work and thank you to you all for coming out, too, because this is a hugely important issue, and it's an issue that each of you can make a difference in, and hopefully in the time we have left, we'll be exploring how, some very practical ways that you can leave here and start to affect change in the world. Each of us are change agents, and we can begin to create change around a very, very important problem. I didn't send the bio. This is actually wonderful for me because I've been doing mind-body stuff for probably 25 years. I'm a yoga instructor. I teach shamanic healing and practice it. I also teach a type of breath work called holotropic breath work. And it was actually this work and becoming kind of internal and learning about myself that got me into conservation work. I now work for Defenders of Wildlife. for a national organization, about 1 million members and activists nationwide. And I began to recognize within myself patterns and how there needed to be balance in the body. And I began to look out at the world around me and see an imbalance in the ecosystems and see the problems that were sort of resulting from that. So that's what led me really into conservation work. And Defenders became involved in farm policy really about 1997. But the conservation community, larger conservation community, has been involved in the Farm Bill for many, many years because we've recognized the incredible destruction that is coming from the current form of agriculture. And I want to talk about that for a second because the current form of agriculture is, I've said this for years, I think it's perhaps the most ecologically destructive force on the planet right now. If you look at from the way things are being grown with our model of agriculture, which is a chemically intensive, concentrated or consolidated model of agriculture, we are seeing declines we're seeing pesticides in gene pools, we're seeing them in water systems, we're seeing soil erosion that is rampant, and we're seeing also, I mean, this form of agriculture is also impoverishing our rural areas, which is maybe something we'll have a chance to get to, I hope so. That was the basis of my early research on the Farm Bureau and what was happening in rural America. But the point is that we have this food system that is destroying the planet. Well, that may cause a problem because all of us eat. You know, I haven't met anybody that doesn't eat. I asked Dr. Weil once about breatharians, and I've heard about them, but I don't know. I guess maybe I'll believe it when I see it. And if we don't change this model, this problem is going to continue to get worse. Now, I've also done permaculture training, and what is fascinating to me from studying that is that we have the ability to grow food in a way that will grow our earth, that'll grow the systems around us. Michael touched on that a bit when he talked about the producer in Virginia. And that system is the vision that we've got to move forward towards. And once we begin that, then we can create a food system that makes ourselves nutritious food for ourselves. We can create a system that builds and buffets up our rural economies so that we're not losing family farmers to the tune of 1,000 a week like we were in the late 90s. And we'll build ecological systems as well because we can use plants now to clean water. We can use, there's very creative ways to use plants to produce food. Dr. Weil was telling me about a plant now that it's being looked at to actually address climate change. And so the point is that with a vision and with action of each of us moving out, embracing this democratic system that we have, we can begin to affect this change. And it's very, very important. It's, maybe agriculture in its current chemically intensive model is not the most destructive. Maybe as we begin to look at our carbon output and climate change, maybe that's going to be worse, but we just heard a statistic that the current method of agriculture contributes 20% to that. So we have tremendous opportunities and a vision of being able to move forward. In fact, when Dan was writing his book, he called me up and I started working on food policy probably like 1997, and frankly it depresses me because it's a very difficult subject. And when we were talking about it, we were kind of going through it, and I suggested to Dan, we need a vision, and that is what we have the ability to do. We have models of this vision. Michael was talking about that. We have models of a type of agriculture. What we don't have is the political will. And maybe we can, I don't want to take too much more time, but maybe as we begin to kind of look at the commodities piece of this and how the Farm Bill has been propped up, has propped up commodities production versus the organic kind of local production, maybe we can begin to talk about that. So I just want to end by saying, thanks for coming out. You all are the future in a way. As you leave this room and begin to make choices that are nutritious for you, you will make choices that are nutritious for our planet. And in doing so, you make choices that are nutritious for a future generation. So you're all part of the change. Thanks. Yeah.
So, my first question is, here we sit in California, and many of the public who's come to join us is local Californians. We're a big farming state, and yet the Farm Bill doesn't frequently come up as a California issue. In all of the 15 years I've lived here, I don't think I've ever seen it on the head of the San Francisco Chronicle or anywhere else. What's up with that, and sort of how do we think about that from the California perspective?
Well, I think Dr. Weil nailed it. I mean, when you say Farm Bill, why would the average person care?
Well, specifically with California agriculture, we grow what are called specialty crops, by and large. There is some rice, actually, the big beneficiaries.
Cotton.
And cotton, that's true. But basically, there's been very little support for people who grow fresh produce. The tradition is you subsidize what are called storable commodities. It's very hard to subsidize broccoli because it doesn't, you don't want an overproduction of broccoli, you can't store it. But you can store all these other crops. But that's changing this year. California farmers are weighing in on the Farm Bill. There's a lot of momentum to help the specialty crop growers for a couple of reasons. One is that they're finding themselves in a much more, they used to be very profitable and not need a lot of help from Washington, and now they've got a lot of competition coming from Asia. And then there is also, though, this emphasis on how to encourage the production of fresh fruits and vegetables, and basically make the healthy calories in the supermarket more competitive with the unhealthy calories. So that will, I think it'll be a more important California issue as time goes on.
And where does, do you have something?
Yeah, just one thing. They're desperately lacking out there, and there's a lot of data on how to follow the money. And you mentioned the Environmental Working Group, EWG.org website, great amount of data, easy to find. But California has received a lot of nutrition assistance. And then we get our cotton and our rice subsidies. So, I think actually we've made our deal as California. It's just now what you find is more and more farmers, especially of fresh fruits and vegetables and the healthy things that are the food pyramid, are saying, hey, what about us? And we just happen in California to grow about half of all the fruits and vegetables for the country.
So as I understand it, there are 5 crops that are primarily affected here, and most of them fall under this monoculture discussion. I have some questions about sort of what does that mean, and also what does it mean from a public health perspective. I know, Michael, you had a chapter that was corn all the way through, pretty much, saying we were eating corn all the way. You said, so what? Why should it matter that we become a race of corn eaters as much as the world has never seen it? Is this necessarily a bad thing? So I'm curious about what the crops are, what the public health impact is, and sort of what the environmental impact is.
Well, I think a useful way to look at it is, Andy alluded to earlier, is what kind of calories in the supermarket are cheap and what kind of ones are expensive. And there was a researcher a couple years ago did a very interesting study. His name is Adam Drunowski, University of Chicago, and he was trying to solve a mystery, which is why is it in America that obesity is a bigger problem among the poor rather than the rich? Historically, obesity is a problem among the rich because they could afford to buy a lot of food, but it's the opposite here. And so he dispatched some graduate students into a supermarket and he gave them $1 and said, how many calories can you buy with that $1? You're on fixed income, you're receiving food stamps, that's what you're in the market for, energy to keep your family going. And what he discovered, it shouldn't be so surprising, which is you could buy 1,200 calories in the middle of the store where all the processed food is, but if you went to the fresh produce, you could only get 250 calories of carrots. And the same was true for soft drinks. Now, why is that? Well, that is not a function of the free market, and it's not a function of nature. It really is a function of these policies. We subsidize the growing of the raw materials for processed food. The carrot growers don't get anything. I'm not saying the answer is necessarily give the carrot growers the same thing, or necessarily to take away support for the corn and soy growers, but the